Hello and welcome to another Mr. Carter Science Special. In this video we're going to be looking at hormones and the menstrual cycle. In particular, we're going to look at the changes that happen in a woman's reproductive system over the 28-day menstrual cycle, and we're going to discuss the functions of the different hormones that control these changes. The menstrual cycle describes the changes that happen in a woman's reproductive system over 28 days. The menstrual cycle will start around 12 years old when a girl reaches puberty. And you can see from the two diagrams in front of you the changes that occur. In this diagram here, we have the cycle starting on day 1 when the period begins, moving through 14 days when ovulation occurs. Then for the next 14 days or so, the lining of the womb remains nice and thick. And then we go back to day 1 when the lining of the womb or the uterus will break down again. It's perhaps clearer on this diagram here, where you can actually see the thickness of the uterus wall measured. So again, on day 1 the uterus wall will break down before building up again, then being maintained and then beginning to break down again. In the diagram above, you can see the levels of two particular hormones, estrogen and progesterone, produced by the ovaries, which control some of these changes. But let's just think about describing the changes that happen before we try and explain the changes that happen. There are 4 basic stages within the menstrual cycle. Stage 1, which begins on day 1, is when the bleeding will start, and the uterus lining will break down for about 4 days, and you can see that from here to here on our diagram. Stage 2, the lining of the womb will build up and thicken again. Of course, we could also say uterus for womb, and that will occur from about day 4 until approximately day 14. The womb or the uterus will thicken into a thick spongy layer of blood vessels ready to receive the fertilized egg cell or embryo. Stage 3 is a very short stage called ovulation, and this is when an egg cell is developed and then released from the ovary at about day 14. There may be some variation in that. It may be a little bit earlier, day 13, or perhaps a day later, day 15, but it will be right in the middle of that menstrual cycle. Stage 14 is when the wall of the uterus is then maintained for about 14 days until day 28. If no fertilized egg lands on the uterus wall by day 28, the spongy lining starts to break down again and the whole process will start again. So what are the hormones that control this menstrual cycle? Well, there are in fact 4 different hormones that control the menstrual cycle: estrogen, progesterone, FSH, known as follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, and they all interact together and influence each other to bring about the changes we've just discussed. Estrogen, for example, causes the lining of the uterus to thicken and grow. Estrogen will inhibit or stop the production of the hormone FSH, and estrogen stimulates the production of another hormone, LH. Estrogen also has a role in maintaining the lining of the uterus after ovulation. Progesterone maintains the lining of the uterus, but a lack of progesterone will cause the lining of the uterus to break down. Both progesterone and estrogen are produced in the ovaries of the woman's reproductive system. FSH is also known as follicle stimulating hormone, and as the name suggests, FSH stimulates the follicle within an ovary to mature and begin to produce estrogen. LH, or luteinizing hormone, will stimulate the release of an egg cell during ovulation. LH and FSH are both produced here in the pituitary gland, very close to the hypothalamus in the brain. But how exactly do those four hormones work together to bring about the changes of the menstrual cycle? Well, you may well see diagrams like this, and you would be expected to explain and interpret these diagrams as you go along. The key thing to look for is at the top here. Here you can see a follicle that is inside the ovary of a woman's reproductive system, and you can see at the very beginning, day one, that follicle is very, very small. Now the follicle is made up of the egg cell, an immature egg cell, surrounded by a number of other cells, and it's these extra cells surrounding the egg cell that will begin to produce the hormone estrogen. So on day one, the follicle begins to mature and be stimulated. Why? Because the levels of this FSH hormone are increasing, causing the follicle to be stimulated. Once the follicle has been stimulated, the follicle will then grow and mature, and the cells will begin to release estrogen. So by about day 5, the estrogen levels are increasing. But estrogen will inhibit the levels of FSH. It will stop the pituitary gland producing FSH. So you'll notice that around day 5, the FSH levels begin to decrease here. As the follicle continues to mature and the egg inside it continues to mature, more and more estrogen is produced, and estrogen causes the lining of the uterus to grow and thicken, and you can see that in the final diagram at the bottom. When estrogen levels peak at about day 13, this causes another change. The estrogen is carried in the blood of the body to the pituitary gland and stimulate the release of LH. LH causes ovulation, and you can see in the diagram at the top, the egg cell has been released from the follicle. The follicle now changes its name because it's no longer containing the egg cell, and it's now called a yellow body. And the yellow body stops producing as much estrogen and produces more progesterone. And you can see here, after ovulation, the progesterone levels massively increase and then are maintained. And this helps to maintain the lining of the uterus. But as the yellow body begins to break down at around day 20, 25, going towards 28, it's no longer producing progesterone, so the lining of a womb begins to break down, and the period therefore begins. Now, everything I've just discussed can actually be quite difficult to remember, so I've written it all down here, and you can follow along with the diagrams on the left hand side. Between day 1 and 4, the levels of progesterone will fall, and this causes the lining of the uterus to break down and the period to begin, as you can see here. At the same time, the levels of FSH produced by the pituitary gland begin to rise. FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, travels in the blood to the ovary and stimulates the follicle containing the egg cell to mature, as you can see here. As the follicle matures, it begins to produce the hormone estrogen, and estrogen causes the lining of the uterus to thicken from day 5 to about day 14, as you can see here. There's the lining of the uterus breaking down in the period, and here is the uterus thickening again as estrogen has been produced. As the concentration of estrogen continues to increase, it causes the pituitary gland to stop producing FSH because estrogen inhibits FSH production. So only one follicle per month is stimulated. Then the high levels of estrogen also stimulate the pituitary gland in the brain to release LH, luteinizing hormone. You can see that here. The luteinizing hormone will travel in the blood and stimulate the ovaries to release the egg cell during ovulation. After ovulation, the follicle will begin to break down and form the yellow body, also known as a corpus luteum. The cells of the yellow body will be producing less estrogen, and they begin to produce progesterone. Together, progesterone and estrogen will maintain the lining of the uterus between day 14 and towards day 28. Towards the end of the menstrual cycle, the cells of the yellow body begin to die and they stop producing progesterone. And the lack of progesterone causes the lining of the uterus to break down again, and so the menstrual cycle will start again. And there you can see the progesterone levels decreasing, and after day 28 there is the period beginning again, and so the menstrual cycle will begin again. Remember, the menstrual cycle will always begin on day 1, the first day of the period. Now, the 2 paragraphs on these 2 slides you've just seen are an excellent 6-mark answer when you are expected to describe and explain the role of the hormones in regulating the menstrual cycle. I hope you've enjoyed this short video on the hormones in the menstrual cycle. Comment below, let me know what you've learned. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you very much for your time.